Ask any American child to draw a house, and they will draw the same house. The roof is a steep triangle. The body is a square. There is a chimney rising from the middle of the roof. There is a door in the middle of the front. There are 2 windows, one on each side of the door. Sometimes there is a path leading up to the door. Sometimes there is a sun in the corner of the page. The lines are usually drawn in crayon. The chimney is sometimes smoking. This is not a generic drawing of a generic house. The child is drawing a specific architectural type with a specific name that originated in a specific place. The house in the drawing is a Cape Cod. It was first built by English settlers on the coastal sand of Massachusetts in the late 1600s as a low, sturdy, almost windowless shelter for Puritan farmers and fishermen surviving the Atlantic winter. 300 years later, after a long stretch of obscurity, the same shape became the most built single-family house in the post-war American suburb. The houses on the streets of the original Levittown, where 17,000 of them went up in 4 years between 1947 and 1951, were nearly all variants on the same plan. The Cape Cod house is the one piece of American architecture that is almost universally recognized and almost universally not understood. The shape, in either era, is the same shape. The story is not the same story. The shape is so familiar that almost no American notices it as a shape. It is a low rectangle, 1 story tall or 1.5. The roof is steep, close to 45 degrees, almost as steep as the side of an isosceles triangle. The roof is gabled on the short ends, which is to say the triangle of the roof faces left and right, and the long flat slope of the roof runs across the front and the back of the house. The chimney is in the middle. The door is in the middle of the long front side. The windows flank the door symmetrically, usually 2 on each side, sometimes 1 and 1, sometimes 1 and 2. There is no porch. There is no second-story extension over the door. There are usually no dormers in the original version. The whole building, when seen from the road, sits low and broad and quiet. In its earliest documented form, the building was about 30 feet wide and 20 feet deep, 600 square feet on the ground floor, a central brick chimney occupying the geometric center of the plane, sometimes wider than the front door, with up to 4 fireplaces letting onto 4 small rooms arranged around it. A pitched attic above, usually unfinished, used for storage and for sleeping the children of the household when the small downstairs rooms were full. The framing was heavy oak. The cladding was wood shingle, hand-rived from local pine or cedar. The roof was wood shingle as well, replaced once a generation. The foundation was fieldstone. The chimney was brick. The historian Timothy Dwight IV, who served as the president of Yale College from 1795 to 1817, traveled across the New England coast in the summers of his presidency and wrote about the houses he saw. In the published volumes of his travels in New England and New York, issued posthumously beginning in 1821, Dwight described in particular the small, low houses of the Cape Cod Peninsula. They had a distinctive shape. They were widespread. They had no formal name. Dwight called them simply Cape Cod houses. The name stuck. By the middle of the 19th century, the term Cape Cod house was the standard way of referring to this specific architectural type. By the 20th century, the same name covered both the original 17th century survival shelters and a series of revivals, adaptations, and mass-produced versions that, between them, became the most built single-family house in the country. Cape Cod, the geographical feature, is a hooked peninsula of sand and pine that extends about 60 miles into the North Atlantic from the southeastern coast of Massachusetts. The peninsula is, in geological terms, the southern terminal moraine of the last continental ice sheet, deposited about 20,000 years ago and shaped, since by the wind, the tide, and the storms. The wind in particular is the dominant fact of the Cape's climate. Stand on the elbow of Cape Cod in February. The Atlantic comes at you in long sustained pulls that do not let up between sunrise and sunset. The temperature is in the 20s. The wind is steady at 20 miles an hour with gusts to 40. The salt spray, blown inland from the breakers, ices the trunks of the scrub pine. Every tree in the visible landscape is leaning northwest, away from the prevailing southeasterly. Standing in this wind, fully dressed for it, a person can feel cold to the bone within 10 minutes. Standing in this wind in the year 1680, in a wool coat over a linen shirt, with a wood-burning hearth 20 feet away as the only available heat source, was a different proposition entirely. The first English settlers arrived on Cape Cod in November of 1620, at the place that became Provincetown. They did not stay. They continued across Cape Cod Bay to the mainland and established Plymouth Colony. Over the next 50 years, smaller groups of settlers, drawn by the fishing and the farmable land between the dunes, established towns on Cape Cod itself. Sandwich in 1637, Barnstable in 1639, Yarmouth in 1639, Eastham in 1651. The settlers were Puritan and Pilgrim families, English by origin, agricultural and seafaring in their working lives. They needed houses. What they had been building in England in the regions most of them had come from was not going to work on Cape Cod. The English rural cottage of the early 17th century was built of half-timber framing with wattle and daub infill, a wooden skeleton with woven sticks and clay packed between the studs. The walls were not airtight, the roofs were thatched. The houses were designed for the relatively mild damp of the English countryside. On Cape Cod, in February, in a sustained 20-mile-an-hour onshore wind with snow blowing horizontally, an English wattle and daub cottage would be uninhabitable inside of one winter. What the settlers built instead was something else. The form took roughly 50 years to settle. By the end of the 17th century, the New England settlers, drawing on English memory, on construction techniques borrowed in some cases from Dutch building traditions encountered during their stay in Holland before sailing for North America, and on what they could see worked through trial and error, had arrived at a particular set of solutions to the climate problem. The roof was steep, close to 45 degrees, for two reasons. Snow slides off a 45-degree roof in a single sheet rather than accumulating, which kept roof loads under the structural limits of the framing. And wind passes over a steep roof more cleanly than over a shallow one. The steep slope reduces the lift force that pulls a low roof off its fasteners in a high gale. The roof was gabled on the short ends so that the long roof line presented its broadside to the south, which on Cape Cod was the direction the most sheltered wall faced. The walls were low. A one-story house, at most a 1.5-story house with the half-story tucked under the roof, presented the smallest possible windward profile. A taller house caught more wind. The chimney was in the middle. The chimney was the heat source for the building. A central chimney with up to 4 fireplaces meant that one column of brick, heated continuously through the winter by a single wood fire managed in shifts by the family, radiated warmth in every direction into the 4 small rooms clustered around it. The mass of the chimney also acted as a heat reservoir. The brick stored heat during the day and released it at night, smoothing out the temperature swings between fed and unfed fires. The same chimney mass, structurally, anchored the center of the building against wind torque on the roof. The door was in the middle of the long side. The windows flanked it. The number of windows depended on the family's resources at the time of building. A poor family with a small lot would build a half cape, door at one end, 2 windows on the other. Side, total width about 20 feet, and add to it later as they could afford to. A more prosperous family might build a 3/4 cape, with the door slightly off-center, 2 windows on one side and 1 on the other. The fully realized version was the full cape, with the door in the geometric center and 2 windows on each side, a total width of about 40 feet. The number of windows on the front of the house in the New England villages of the 1700s communicated the family's standing in the same way a brick or wood number on a modern doorway communicates the address. The walls were close-set wooden planks, sometimes vertical, sometimes horizontal, of local pine or oak, packed tight enough to be windproof and weatherproof without insulation. The exterior cladding was wood shingle. The shingles were left unpainted. Within 5 years, the salt and the sun and the wind weathered the shingles to a silvery gray, the color the Cape Cod house has been known for ever since. The whole building, taken as a system, was a winter machine. Its job was to keep a family of 7 or 8, plus livestock when the worst of the weather came, alive through 5 months of cold. The building did that job. The buildings that survive from the 17th century survive because they were built well enough to last 350 years. There is a Cape Cod house in the town of Sandwich on the western elbow of the Cape that has been continuously occupied since the late 1600s. It is called the Hoxie House. It is now operated as a small house museum by the town of Sandwich and is open to visitors during the warmer months. The Hoxie House sits on a low rise above a small pond. From the road, the building is unmistakably a cape, low, broad, side-gabled, with a steep roof, a central chimney, and weathered wood shingle siding. The original section dates to approximately 1675. The house has a saltbox profile at the rear, where the roof drops in a long slope down to a one-story addition. The front door is centered. The windows are small, with diamond-shaped leaded panes that have been restored to their 17th century pattern. The interior is dark in the way that all unelectrified 17th century interiors are dark. The daylight that comes through small leaded windows on a cloudy New England morning is not very much daylight. Walk through the front door of the Hoxie house, and the first thing you experience is the chimney. It is a brick mass nearly 5 feet wide that occupies the dead center of the floor plan. The doors of 3 rooms, a hall, a parlor, and a small entry, open onto it. Each of the 3 rooms has a fireplace cut into the chimney mass. The rooms themselves are small. The hall, the largest room, is a multi-purpose space about 16 by 20 feet that served as kitchen, workshop, dining room, and on cold nights as a bedroom for some members of the household. The parlor was the more formal room, used for the family's best furniture and for the reception of visitors. The kitchen and work duties of the household on a typical 17th century Cape happened in the hall. There was no separate kitchen. The ceiling height is low. A 6-foot person can stand upright, but the ceiling beam is 2 inches over their head. The low ceiling reduces the volume of air the chimney has to heat, which is the entire reason the ceiling is low. A house with 8-foot ceilings in the same climate, with the same wood-burning fireplaces, would have been impossible to keep warm. The floor is wide plank pine, smoothed by 350 years of foot traffic. The walls are plastered over the original heavy plank framing, the plaster a later addition. The original interior surfaces would have been the unfinished wood of the wall planks, smoke darkened over the decades into a near black. The smell of the building, even today, is faintly of wood smoke. The smoke, soaked into the planks for 3 centuries, is part of the house. The Hoxie house had been continuously occupied as a private residence until the 1950s, when the last family living there moved out and the town of Sandwich acquired the property and began to restore it as a museum. For the previous 275 years, families had lived in the building, raised children in it, run small businesses out of it, repaired its chimney, replaced its shingles, added the rear lean-to that became the salt box profile, and made dozens of small modifications. The building, as it stands today, is the accumulated record of those families. What the Hoxie house documents, more clearly than most surviving capes, is the original shape of the form. Strip away the salt box lean-to. Strip away the later windows. Strip away the plaster. What remains is the 4 square with a chimney plan that the New England settlers worked out sometime in the late 1600s, that they refined through the 1700s, and that became the dominant rural and small-town house of coastal New England by the year 1800. Through the 18th century, the Cape Cod form moved beyond Cape Cod itself. As New England settlement expanded inland and northward, the same low, broad rectangle with a central chimney and a steep roof became the standard small house of rural Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, eastern New York, southern New Hampshire, and into Maine. The reasons were the same. The climate was the same. The available materials were the same. The form worked. A village in eastern Massachusetts in 1780 would typically contain a few dozen Cape Cod houses in various sizes. Half capes for the poorer families, 3/4 capes for the middling, full capes for the more prosperous farmers and shopkeepers, clustered around a meeting house, a tavern, a few small shops. The houses were built by the families themselves with help from neighbors, by local carpenters, by itinerant builders. The construction techniques were known. The materials were local. A new full cape might take a single summer to frame and close in, with the family then living through the first winter while the interior was finished. By 1800, the form was so widespread across coastal and rural New England that it was the visual default. To draw a New England house in the early 19th century was to draw a cape. Then, between roughly 1830 and 1880, the cape stalled. Two things happened. The first was that American architectural fashion shifted. The federal style, the Greek revival, and the Italianate succeeded each other through the early and middle 19th century as the dominant patterns for new construction. These styles favored taller buildings, central halls, more formal floor plans, decorative cornices, columned porches, and a general impression of mass and verticality. The Cape, by contrast, looked low and old-fashioned. Builders of new houses in the prosperous towns of New England by 1850 were building Greek revivals with 2-story facades and pediments. The Cape looked like what the grandparents had lived in. The second thing that happened was that the rural New England economy went into decline. Manufacturing migrated into the mill towns and the industrial cities. The young people followed it. Many of the rural villages where the Cape had been the dominant house type were depopulating. The capes that stood in those villages were not torn down mostly. They were too solid for that. They were instead occupied by older residents, eventually abandoned, eventually left to weather. Some collapsed, most did not. By 1900, the Cape Cod house had a complicated reputation. It was old. It was associated with rural decline. It was small, and small houses were not what a successful American family aspired to in the years before the First World War. It was, in the language of the period, a cottage, a word that meant either picturesque or impoverished depending on who was using it. But the Cape was not gone. The houses were still standing mostly all over coastal New England, and the form itself as a memory was about to be picked up and put back to work. In 1925, a young architect named Royal Barry Wills opened a small office in Boston. He had graduated from MIT and worked briefly for a Boston firm before going out on his own. His specialty, by choice, was the small house. He was 29 years old. He had no national reputation. He had a particular interest in the architecture of 17th and 18th century New England. Over the next 37 years, until his death in 1962, Royal Barry Wills became the single most influential American small house architect of his generation, and the building he became most associated with was the Cape Cod house. What Wills did was simple in concept and exacting in execution. He took the 17th century New England Cape, the low rectangle, the steep roof, the central chimney, the symmetrical front, and he refined the proportions of the building, fitting by fitting, until they read as inevitable to the modern eye. He calibrated the slope of the roof against the height of the walls. He calibrated the width of the chimney against the width of the front door. He calibrated the spacing of the clapboards, the horizontal exposure, narrower near the ground, slightly wider higher up, a subtle perspective trick that made the building feel stable and grounded. He calibrated the size and the placement of the windows so that the front of the house, seen from the public road, presented as an exercise in symmetry without rigidity. Wills published his first book on small houses in 1938, Houses for Good Living. It was a modest publication. It contained 26 designs. Most of them were capes. The book sold steadily. Wills published a second book in 1946 called Houses for Homemakers. This one became a national bestseller. It contained another set of designs, almost all of them variations on the cape, calibrated for the post-war small house market that was about to explode. Wills's office by 1950 was producing custom-designed Cape Cod houses for clients across the country for fees that ranged from a few $100s for a stock plan to several thousand for a fully customized commission. His designs were widely copied, both legally and illegally, by builders who lifted them from the books and built them as their own. The Royal Barry Wills aesthetic, the carefully proportioned cape with traditional detailing, set on a small lot with a flagpole and flower boxes, became the visual shorthand for the right kind of small American house in the magazines and shelter publications of the late 1930s, the 1940s, and the 1950s. What Wills had done, by the time of his death, was rescue the Cape Cod house from its rural decline reputation. He had repositioned it as the modern small house ideal. He had also, by demonstrating that the form could be designed to a high standard at small scale, prepared the ground for what came next, which was Levittown. In 1947, on a tract of bulldozed potato field on Long Island, about 30 miles east of Manhattan, a construction company named Levitt and Sons began building a planned subdivision of small single-family houses for returning World War II veterans. The construction company was led by Abraham Levitt and his two sons, William and Alfred. William, the older son, had run the construction operations of a U.S. Navy housing program during the war and had developed, in that role, a system for building thousands of small houses in a hurry. The system was simple: break the construction process into 26 discrete steps, train a crew for each step, and run the crews from foundation to finish work in a precise sequence. A house, by this system, could go from cleared lot to finished move-in condition in about 27 days, with 30 houses being built simultaneously on a given block. The first version of the Levittown house, built in 1947 and 1948, was a one-story Cape Cod. 25 feet wide, 32 feet deep, 800 square feet on the ground floor. An unfinished attic above, with stairs roughed in but no walls, intended for future expansion as the family grew. A central chimney, a steep roof, a door centered between two windows on each side. Wood shingle siding, asphalt shingle roof, hardwood floors, a small kitchen at the rear, a living room across the front, 2 small bedrooms at the back, 1 bathroom, the price of the first Levittown. Houses was $7,900. With a mortgage backed by the Veterans Administration, a returning veteran could move in with no down payment and a 30-year loan at 4% interest. The monthly payment was $65, which in 1948 was less than the rent on a comparable apartment in New York City. The Levitts built 1,000 houses in their first year. They built 6,000 in their second year. By 1951, when the original Levittown was complete, they had built 17,447 houses on the same plan. The 800-square-foot Cape Cod with the unfinished attic, across a development of 7.5 square miles. The Levittown houses sold faster than they could be built. The Levitts, by 1950, were running waiting lists of 50,000 families. What the 17,447 Levittown capes did, between them, was define what the post-war American suburb looked like. They defined what the post-war American single-family house looked like. They defined what the post-war American mortgage looked like. They defined what the post-war American family was supposed to do: buy the house, raise the children in it, finish the attic when the third child was born, mow the lawn on Saturdays, send the kids to the local school, and accumulate over the 30 years of the mortgage the home equity that would become the basis of the family's middle-class wealth. The Cape Cod house, the same low rectangle with a central chimney that English Puritans had worked out on a windswept beach in 1675, was now the basic unit of the largest piece of mass housing in American history. The houses are mostly still there. Most of them have been added onto, dormered out, sided over, and modified beyond recognition. But the original 800-square-foot footprint is still inside almost every house in the original Levittown. Strip the additions away, and the Cape is still under them. What the Cape as a small house ideal was advertised as in the magazines and the FFHA brochures of 1948 was the ordinary American house for the ordinary American family. What the Cape as a financed product was actually doing in 1948 was something else. The Federal Housing Administration, established in 1934, had been the federal agency responsible since then for ensuring residential mortgages. The FHA's underwriting manual in the 1930s, the 1940s, and into the 1950s contained explicit policies on what kinds of neighborhoods qualified for FHA-backed lending and what kinds did not. Neighborhoods with black residents, or neighborhoods near black residents, or neighborhoods that the FHA's local appraisers judged to be at risk of becoming racially mixed, were graded as poor lending risks. The FHA refused to insure mortgages in those neighborhoods. The system was known, in the language of the FHA's own maps, as redlining. The Veterans Administration Loan Program, established in 1944 under the GY Bill, used the FHA's underwriting standards. A returning black veteran in 1948 had the same VA loan benefit, in theory, that a returning white veteran had. In practice, he could not use the benefit in any neighborhood that the FHA had graded as protected from racial integration, which was nearly every new suburban development in the country. The deeds for the original Levittown houses, the 17,447 of them, contained a covenant. Section 25 of the Standard Levittown Lease and Deed read, in 1948, "No dwelling shall be used or occupied by members of other than the Caucasian race." The covenant was enforced. Black families, including black veterans returning from the war, were barred from purchasing in Levittown. The first black family to legally buy a house in the original Levittown moved in 1957, 10 years after construction began, and only after a sustained civil rights legal challenge that included death threats and a sustained campaign of harassment against the family for the first 2 years they lived there. The Cape Cod house in Levittown, in other words, was simultaneously the most accessible single-family house in American history and the most racially exclusive. It was both at once. The same low rectangle with the central chimney, the same shape every American child draws on a piece of paper, was the architectural form through which the post-war American middle class, defined as legally and structurally white, was assembled, financed, and inherited. The legal racial covenants in the deeds were ruled unenforceable by the U.S. Supreme Court in 1948, in a case called Shelley versus Kramer. The covenants did not disappear from the deeds. They became unenforceable in court, but remained in the documents. More importantly, the FHA underwriting standards that had created the conditions for the covenants in the first place did not change in any meaningful way until the late 1960s. The result was that the wealth that accumulated in the Cape-lined streets of Levittown and its hundreds of imitators across the country between 1948 and 1968 accumulated almost exclusively in white families. The Cape Cod house, as a system, did its job. The job, however, was different from the job advertised on the brochure. In the years since the original Levittown, the Cape Cod house has continued to be built. New construction in suburbs, in resort towns, in second home developments, in coastal Massachusetts and Connecticut, in the New Jersey shore, in the Maine shore, in the Outer Banks of North Carolina, has continued to use variations on the form. New capes are still being built today. The form has become a marketing category, a real estate keyword, a brand identity. Anywhere on a real estate listing in New England that the words Cape Cod charm appear, what is being sold is the silhouette. What stands today? In numbers. The original 17th and 18th century capes, the survival shelters built by Puritan families on the windswept coast of Massachusetts, survive in the hundreds. Most of the surviving original capes are in the towns of Cape Cod itself: Sandwich, Barnstable, Yarmouth, Eastham, Provincetown, and along the coastal villages of southeastern Massachusetts and Rhode Island. Many are private residences, some are house museums, some are protected within local historic districts. Many more were lost over the centuries to fire, to demolition for newer construction, and, in the past 40 years, to tear down pressure as coastal lots have become valuable enough that a small original cape on a quarter-acre lot is worth less, in the developer's calculation, than the lot underneath it stripped of the building and built up into a 5,000-square-foot vacation home. The early 20th century Royal Barry Wills designs and their imitators stand in the tens of thousands across the older suburbs of the Northeast and the Midwest. They are recognized by people who know what they are looking at, by their carefully proportioned facades and their faintly colonial detail trim. They are mostly still occupied as single-family homes. The post-war tract capes, the Levittown-derived 800-square-foot houses with the unfinished attics, stand in the millions across the suburbs that the post-war housing boom built. Most have been added onto. Most have been finished out, the attics turned into bedrooms, the rear extended for a family room or a kitchen, the original 800-square-foot box buried inside a 1,400 or 1,800 or 2,200-square-foot remodeled house. The original footprint, in many cases, can still be identified by walking around the building and looking for the seam between the original construction and the addition. The seam is usually visible if you know what you are looking for. What survives, more than any single house, is the silhouette. Drive any suburban arterial road in the eastern half of the United States. Look at the houses, the ones built between roughly 1935 and 1960, the years of the Royal Barry Wills revival and the Levittown boom and the dozens of imitator developments that the boom triggered are nearly all variations on the same shape. The steep roof, the centered chimney, the symmetrical front, the low, broad rectangle. Some have been so heavily added onto that the original cape is hard to see. Some are still recognizably what they started as. The shape is in the bones of the suburb. The same shape, reduced to 5 lines on a piece of paper, is the shape every American child still draws when asked to draw a house. This is what the Cape Cod house is. A specific architectural type with a specific origin in the late 17th century on a specific peninsula in Massachusetts that became the most built single-family house in American history through a combination of climate, design tradition, federal mortgage policy, and one architect's careful proportioning. The same shape that kept Puritan families alive through the winter of 1675 became, 3 centuries later, the basic financial unit of the American middle class. It also became the architectural form through which the federal government, by deciding which neighborhoods to insure and which neighborhoods to refuse, sorted families by race into the streets they were and were not allowed to live on. The shape is still everywhere. The history is mostly forgotten. The child draws the house, the crayon leaves the page. The silhouette is the same silhouette that an English Puritan settler working with hand tools on a windswept peninsula on the Atlantic coast of Massachusetts in 1675 was framing into being, log by log, in the year of his arrival. The roof is steep. The chimney is in the middle. The door is in the middle of the front. There are 2 windows on each side. The lines are drawn in crayon. The chimney is sometimes smoking.